The next big issue that people face is parenting. And that we kind of come by this honestly. Oh my gosh, I missed a couple. Thank you, Margi. Okay, in communicating, we also have loss of friends and community. And this is a big deal because in Mormonism, we're not like, let's just say Presbyterians or Lutherans or, the types of churches where if you go once a month or once every 3 months or even once a year, where like your entire identity and community and friendship is wrapped around your congregation. I remember in Mormonism, when we lived in Seattle, our friends or associates tended to be the Mormons in Seattle. And that was true in Dallas, and that was true in Chicago. Like Mormons tend to be very tight-knit in their communities. And it tends to be the sense that your friendships, your relationships, your community are all connected to Mormonism. And so, of course, there will be casualties, or there will likely be casualties in friendships and in community if you have a faith crisis and you're open about it. And especially if you're in a faith crisis and open about it and don't handle it wisely, you will certainly risk burning bridges and jeopardizing relationships in terms of friendships and community. What do you think about that?
Well, I also think it's largely inevitable that you'll have shifts in your relationships with people, even if you communicate really, really in your mind compassionately. And I just think it's that filtering, that's what I tend to call it. It tends to just occur. And a lot of that is through that, how we were talking about communication earlier. Some people, even with the best communication, relationships are strained, or you have people that don't accept what you're trying to say or can't observe a boundary, and so there is, even with the best communication, where you've done not necessarily anything wrong or misplayed anything, or there is a natural filtering when it comes to friends, community, and I would even say family members as well. And to expect that, and just for a little bit of the gift or the hope is that you, amidst those losses, will clearly be able to identify the deeper relationships, and there will be new relationships that rise up in this empty space where you've lost, people that meet you where you are right now.
I love that point that holes will develop, and you'll mourn them and you'll grieve them like a dear friendship or a community, but you can't just end with the hole. Every hole that develops from a faith crisis becomes an opportunity for an upgrade. And it is possible to upgrade your community, to upgrade your friendships, and not meaning better people, superior people, just people that are a better fit towards the place that you end up growing. That's all. And so you can mourn it and be sad about it, but then you can move on and celebrate the new relationships and the new communities that you find. And you may find them to be more compatible, more rich, more authentic than you did before. Anything you want to add, Natasha?
Yeah, and I would just encourage people to not fall into black and white thinking about this. Like I oftentimes hear, well, so I didn't have any real friends, in Mormonism, because once I left, then those friends tended to disappear. And the reality is that especially in friendships, we tend to gear towards people who are similar to us. And once there are shifts and changes, some friendships can survive that and some don't as much. But it doesn't have to mean that it was that all those times that you shared with that person that were beneficial and good and helpful, that somehow they didn't count or that they didn't matter or that they weren't real. So I would just caution people from having black and white thinking about that.
Love it. There was a point that I had back on the marriage conversation that I skipped, that Margi wanted to make sure I mentioned because it was important in our relationship. So if you guys will forgive me, we're going to rewind back to the marriage portion and talk about it really briefly. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. One of the things you have to realize, there's this really famous marriage and family, and I think sex therapist named Esther Perel. Are you a fan of Esther Perel, Natasha?
I love Esther Perel.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I have a quote in my mind that she's said, which is that everybody or most people, who get married will get married at least 3 times in their lives. It'll either be to the same partner or to a different partner. And what she's implying there is that once you get married on a certain foundation and as certain individuals, but then you fast forward 7 years, each of you grows in new ways and your values change. You'll likely at some point, or the kids start coming or whatever it is, or the kids leave, whenever the big milestones are, at some point you're going to hit this crisis in the relationship where you feel like the marriage is dead. And the point she's making is, okay, maybe the marriage is dead. Maybe the foundation you built it upon, or many of the major pillars upon which you based your marriage, have crumbled. Maybe the joy and even the sexual fulfillment or the intimacy or the fun has gone out of the marriage. But that doesn't mean that your marriage, your relationship is over. What she recommends is a new marriage, which means I, John, come to my marriage with Margi in 2012, a broken and a different person. Margi comes to the marriage in 2012, a different person, never broken. And
No,
many of the
definitely broken.
oh, sorry, broken open by me. And then
No,
I'm kidding. I'm just
Okay.
trying to be self-effacing.
I think it's important to model though that these things happen, by being alive,
Yeah,
by being
totally,
a human being.
totally.
Yes.
I'm just kidding. Okay. And then many of the foundations of our marriage by 2012 had crumbled. And we looked at divorce, we looked at separation. But then what we did is we decided that we were both in for another round. And so here we are 6 years after almost a catastrophic failure, happier than we've ever been, when before we were pretty sure it was over. And that is because we entered into a new marriage. Is that what you wanted me to say, sweetie? Did I cover it?
Well, I do feel like the idea of creating and updating our relationships with people is a very important part of being conscious in our lives. And I think there are elements that are really tough. Forgiveness can be a lot of work, I think, but there are also really exciting parts of that. Creativity and a coming together as the people you are now, as opposed to 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And by the way, I'm curious what you think about this, Natasha. I do believe this is that this can happen in religious transition. I also feel like this is part of life. It happens to marriages outside religion all the time. I mean, think about the type of marriage you need with young children as opposed to empty nest, right? In the marriage where you're dealing with like your kids leaving home. Well, there your needs look really different, or with a spouse that's sick and you're caretaking. Different things we're asked throughout life to renegotiate all the time, actually. And for a marriage where you are really your expectations are that you're wanting to share a life together, you can expect that you're probably gonna have to burn down. That's what we've done. We've definitely had to burn down our marriage a couple times and just say, you know what, not working. We're starting over and we're gonna try this. Thoughts? Yeah. What are your thoughts, Natasha?
Well, you started off with the work of Esther Perel, and Esther Perel is mainly talking about this from the construct of infidelity. So it's an interesting way to reframe, a big moment in a lot of people's lives when they have to face something like infidelity. Not that I want to compare infidelity to faith transition, but I will compare it in the sense that it's a big moment, right? For a lot of people, it's a big moment where you have to kind of it's not, I mean, we always hear that you have to constantly work on your marriage, and that's true regardless of whether you're going through big moments or not, right? So that's just kind of the day in and day out. But I think what Esther Perel is talking about is that given developmental life cycle and the fact that we're all living into our 80s and 90s these days, more often than not. So you're going to spend, potentially if you married your partner in your 20s, you're going to spend 60 years with this partner. The chances of betrayals, infidelities, shifts, major shifts like a faith transition, just statistically go up. And so I really do find that useful. That I think when oftentimes in the Mormon narrative, you have this script where you get married in the temple, you get married forever and eternity and all is well, and everything will kind of just stay as is. And sure, you'll face problems, but they'll kind of come from the outside in. And you don't realize that a big quote unquote problem that you're facing is that you're growing up with this person, you're adulting with this person, you're developing into who you're going to be as a 40-year-old, as a 50-year-old, as a 60-year-old. And in every one of those things, you're having to rework your marriage as well. So I would just second pretty much everything both of you have said.
Love it. Mickey, glad you wrote in, Mickey. Mickey writes, we change. It would be weird if we didn't expect our partners and marriage wouldn't change as well. Yeah, so she's basically saying, I change. Wouldn't it be weird if I expected you not to change? And then wouldn't it be weird if that didn't affect our marriage? Thank you, Mickey, for chiming in and sharing that perspective. And thank you, Margi, for having me go back and address that point I missed. That was worth covering. Good stuff. Okay. Another area of complexity in communication before we move on to some final points is communicating with your bishop and your bishopric members and your ward and your stake president and your stake presidency members and just, members in your congregation. So many of us were in the bishopric or least cited presidency, or were respected members of the ward, and wards are small, so people know each other. And by the way, there's that pesky tithing settlement at the end of the year, and those temple recommends expire, and the bishoprics don't always like that. And then there's children going on and off of missions, and children marrying in and out of the temple, and home teachers, or what do we call them now? Ministering people. What do we call them, Natasha?
Ministers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got all these different ways that we're interacting with our ward members and leaders. And by the way, those leaders can have a lot of power over us. They can have the power to keep us from our own child's wedding. They can have the power to gossip about us to other ward members. And that can impact our livelihood or our jobs or our reputations. They can also offer themselves as support and helpful, but it's sometimes complicated. And there are delicate things like, how do I get out of a calling I may not feel good about anymore? How do I handle tithing settlement or temple recommend issue? Can I get a temple recommend if I'm not necessarily Orthodox like I used to be? Do I have to just resign from the church? Can I just go when I want? And then if I do, like, let's say Margi goes to church, but I don't, how was that for you, sweetie? What was one of the complexities of when you were attending church and I wasn't that kind of got on your nerves?
I think for those attending, you feel like you're put in a position where you're answering for your spouse who's not there, why they're not there. And so
what was that like?
Trying to learn, it was very valuable, but I had to actually learn. I almost scripted it out depending on who would ask me what level of trust I had, what I would say, and how I would say it.
Yeah, that's really good. We'll talk about that, how to measure your communication with someone based on the safetiness for you and the safetiness for them,
and
right?
What their intentions were really in asking. Do they really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But all that can be really fraught. And I'm going to just give you one piece of advice when dealing with, I'm going to give you two pieces of advice when dealing with ward and stake members. And I'm going to leave it at that and then let Natasha jump in. Less is more. Okay. And don't give away your power, because giving them, being vulnerable and candid. I just listened to a Brene Brown episode the other day, and we all associate vulnerability these days in 2018 with Brene Brown. Mm-hmm. She says, we misunderstand her if we think that her message is that we all need to be vulnerable at all times with all people.
Just go out and be vulnerable, people.
That's basically called masochism. Right, Natasha? You're familiar with that word, right?
Yes, I am. No, and I think that this is an important piece, which again, we'll talk about more later, is boundaries. I think in Mormon narrative scripts, we grew up in a relationship with ecclesiastical authorities where we're asked questions and we're supposed to answer questions. So that's kind of the habit that we're in, and we forget the difference between privacy and honesty. And these are all things that we can talk about more at length in the future. But I think for this particular episode, what we're saying is that this is a very normal thing to have be frustrating.
Yeah.
And it can be very harmful. It can be very hurtful. It can be, a lot of times these people who are serving these positions are your friends or prior friends or even family members. And so it gets even more wrought with discomfort and issues when you feel betrayed by somebody who you felt was supposed to minister to you or help you, and now is maybe disciplining you or is, causing you, in your mind, a lot of harm. So it's just, it's very, and it is very roulette-ish, like we talk about, so in some wards, certain ecclesiastical leaders or auxiliary leaders will respond in certain ways, and in other wards, they respond in different ways. And so it's kind of all over the map.
I'm a little traumatized by this because after I started the podcast and we were a public figures a little bit, the bishop and stake president actually assigned some of my former home teachers to investigate me and to gather information about me. Not to my knowledge, that was never disclosed. And of course, that's a more extreme example. But I would just say, less is more, and be careful what you tell people, and we're going to leave it at that. But that can be complicated, so be gentle. All right.
Can we go back really quickly to the parenting piece? We never
Oh my gosh, that was super important.
Well, because I think that this, we kind of briefly mentioned it in the mixed parenting, or as a mixed parents or mixed faith marriage, but I do think that, well, first of all, some people do divorce and still have to co-parent, and whether or not you feel like you're aligned with your partner, seeing your children either hurt by or even helped by the church can be really fraught with a lot of personal emotion, right? So if you feel like your child is going and listening to messages that you feel is harmful or will be quote unquote, like somebody else mentioned, brainwashed, we have some of those feelings like they're just going to indoctrinate my kids, or they're going to, sometimes what people who are leaving feel is that they're going to kind of undermine my parental authority, right? So I'm going to be the kind of like inactive, parent that in all these stories comes up as we're going to feel sorry for them and it's too bad. And
the cautionary tale, right?
Yeah, I'm now the cautionary tale that my own children are going to look down on me because of my ideas about spirituality and things like that. So this can be very, very painful for those transitioning. Can also, of course, be very challenging and scary to the believing spouse who feels like there's usually a lot of structure and a lot of support for parenting, within the church community, and a lot of values and ideas, that especially as you're parenting teenagers and things of that nature, that can feel very safe and secure. So this is kind of all over the map. And I know that personally, again, this has been very, because I've had kind of kids on both sides. I've had a bisexual child who was very, very harmed by LGBTQ rhetoric in the church. And then I have a child who loves going to church and who we support going to church. And at the same time, I'm always a little worried that I don't quite meet the standards, right, of the other moms who maybe he sees as more, kind of got their Mormon going on a little bit better than me, And so it's, I've been on both sides of that as the transitioner, and it's very bittersweet and extremely painful because your mama bear comes out, your mama dragon comes out, your papa bear, and it just cuts at the core of what you're kind of wired to do, which is to protect your children.
I love it.
Yeah, I would say too, just transitioning in general, I know with my coaching clients, I would say over half of all of my coaching clients, one of the major issues is kind of how do I parent? now that I'm
Yeah.
transitioning, and how it affects, how they view things like control, or, really desiring to be safe for their children. And even how they've, different kind of structures or beliefs that they've bought into around their own children, whether they're kind of depraved versus, highly on their own, worthy and whole and desiring to do good. There's a lot here in the parenting paradigm, and very, very natural shifts that happen that can feel quite destabilizing when you're already feeling like so many other things are changing, and being unearthed at the same time.
Yeah. And I'll just add, we are, thank you, Margi and Natasha, and we're so conditioned, unfortunately, in Mormonism, and I don't think anybody means it intentionally, but I just remember growing up thinking, I feel so sorry for everyone not raised in the church. They must live sad, pathetic, immoral, drab, wretched lives. They don't have the gift of the Holy Ghost. They don't have a prophet to lead them. They don't have all of God's scripture. How can anyone who isn't raised Mormon, not be a prostitute and a drug dealer? And maybe it wasn't that severe, but it was a little bit short of that. And that conditioning leaves you feeling like you couldn't possibly raise a healthy, happy kid to avoid teenage pregnancy, to avoid risky drug use, to just survive into adulthood without Orthodox Mormonism. And so we come by that fear and conditioning, honestly, and it's a real concern. And so I just want to validate that, and say that that's something that's some conditioning that you have to work through. And we will be covering that in a future episode or a future series, how to raise healthy, happy kids as either progressive, unorthodox Mormons or as ex-Mormons. Either one, there's great things in store, but it can be terrifying as a parent. Also, I'll just say, I like to liken Orthodox Mormonism to public schools. In public school, you just literally drive up, drop off your kids, or if they drive themselves, even better, and then they're educated, supposedly. And oftentimes they get a decent, if not an excellent education. Sometimes they get a bad one, but the benefit is you didn't have to worry about it. You didn't have to pull out your calculator, your times tables. You didn't have to remember your equations from linear algebra. You didn't have to remember how to conjugate verbs in English, or what the Newton's first and second law of thermodynamics are. You just drop your kids off at school and they're raised, or they're educated. And religion can provide that. Should a kid have sex? Law of chastity. Should a kid look at porn? Law of chastity. Should a kid drink or do drugs? Word of wisdom. How should a kid spend their weeknights? At church activities. And the church just raises your kid for you. And so it can be very disorienting as a parent to lose that, and then to say, oh my gosh, now my kids are going to be drug dealing prostitutes. It's natural to have those fears, and we're here to tell you good can come from this, but it's scary at the time.
And not that we want to shame sex workers by any means.
Right.
Yes. Not to shame sex workers. Tell us more about that, Natasha.
That's a whole nother podcast.
Okay. That's another podcast, not an episode. That's another podcast. All right. Okay. We've covered a lot of the big doozies, but there are some one-offs that we're going to try and cover. We've got about 11 minutes left, and we're going to try and cover each of these in about a minute. And so what we'll do is we'll do a round robin where we're not going to each feel like we have to all speak on each of these topics, but we'll go around the robin and I'll direct, and each one is going to kind of address a topic. So the first one is dealing with betrayal and anger. Natasha, tell us in 1 minute what you're going to experience in terms of anger.
Yeah, so I think I kind of covered this a little bit with the Nephi complex, but it is really an upsetting, horrible feeling to feel like you've been betrayed either by information or by people. And anger is a very natural, next feeling, which, of course, we always talk about anger being kind of like a secondary emotion because there's usually something underneath it, like pain or sadness. So it's important to tap into that. At the same time, I just want to normalize that anger can be a very appropriate part of the grief cycle. We will talk about that at length and how to manage it and make sure anger doesn't become paralyzing. At the same time, if you are going through a transition or you are connected with somebody who's going through a transition, don't be surprised that there's some anger, and anger in of itself doesn't always have to be a bad thing. It can be a motivator. It can be kind of a cluer inner, right? As far as something is really off here.
Yeah, anger can be freaking awesome. You just don't want to get stuck in it.
Yeah.
Right.
You want to use it to propel
To
you.
go deeper.
Yeah.
Right.
We'll talk all about that, but that's a big one. The next one I'm going to do is spirituality, and I'm going to actually read a comment from Victoria. Victoria is one of our loyal, faithful listeners. Hi, Victoria. You're awesome. I'm pretty sure Victoria's in the UK, so we're extra honored that you're joining us from the UK, Victoria. Victoria writes, the hardest thing for me was losing the idea of Jesus. I saw him as a parent figure and a best friend. He was my counselor when I needed someone to talk to. I felt he loved me and understood me in a way that others couldn't. Throughout my life, I always saw my successes, abilities, and wisdom was all because of God. I felt very grateful to God, but never really saw my own character. When I first started my faith crisis, I began to realize that this is a necessary part of my life and development. I now see that even if there is a God, it is me that has achieved all I have in my life. I may or may not have been guided, but I'm the one who makes the decisions, and I'm the one that chooses to grow and help others. I'm now becoming more empowered, and I'm starting to appreciate myself in a way I couldn't before my faith crisis. And I'm just going to say, Victoria, amen. When, spirituality is so huge, it's a belief, and theology, it's a belief in God, a belief in an atonement and a savior, in an afterlife. It's the plan of salvation. It's eternal families. It's the gift of the Holy Ghost. It's all these safety and obedience to the authority of prophets and to scripture. And when you lose all that, you can feel hollow and naked and dark for sometimes a long time. And it can feel like all the light has gone out of your life, because the church can provide incredible opportunities for spiritual development. As much as you hate the church, I hope you will concede that many people find spiritual fulfillment in the church. For those of you who are angry at the church, and for those of you who are still Orthodox, you get what I'm saying. The church meets those needs. So when you lose your Orthodox faith, you can feel dark and scared for a time. And all we want to say is, like Victoria, there's some light, and sometimes some really bright light at the end of that tunnel. Spiritually, there are people that go through a faith crisis and feel more spiritual at the end of the journey, not less. Or they feel spiritual for the first time after a faith crisis. And some stay in the church and some leave, but you will experience that, and it's an important one. Natasha, can you talk to us about identity?
Well, so again, when I look at my own work, this has been a big one. I mean, and a lot of what you just mentioned from this commenter is just a big part of our identity. We are Mormon, we have certain narratives, we have certain meanings about life that we come at through all of that. And so when you go through a transition, it just really affects every aspect of yourself. And then that's even complicated, I think, in Mormonism as a woman, or as an LGBT member, or even as a man, when you have your identity be so gendered, or be so tied to certain aspects of your sexuality, or so tied to certain aspects of your parenting, like if you're a mother or a father, what roles you're supposed to play. And so all of a sudden, a faith transition kind of shifts a lot of that, and you have to kind of refigure your identity on so many different levels. What does it mean to be a mother? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be heterosexual or have a different type of sexual orientation? What does it mean to be married? What does it mean? All these things that kind of come into my identity. So I think that can be very disconcerting. It can be disorienting. It can be scary. You can feel left without an anchor going out to sea. And so that's a very normal feeling.
Margi went to get our Jimmy John's order that we timed for 1 o'clock. So Jimmy John's came early. So I'll excuse Margi for a second. And I want to give a shout out to Kimberly. Kimberly, karaokeing with you and Margi last Saturday was one of the highlights of our 2018. So love and blessings to you, Kimberly, who's a faithful listener to many podcasts, including this one. It's Kimberly. And she says bows to Victoria. So Victoria, Kimberly is sending you props, and we love you, Kimberly, as well. Check out my interview with Kimberly Anderson on Mormon Stories podcast. It's definitely a great interview. Jana writes, hugs Natasha Helfer Parker. Ugh, I missed this. I'll be restarting this whole episode. Hey, Jana, we always love you, and we're glad. We hope you do re-listen if you find the need. Courtney writes, very hard. I think that she's writing about spirituality. Courtney writes, I think there are ways to keep Jesus even when you lose the restoration. And she's referring listeners to Rob Bell, Richard Rohr, and others who have great nuanced perspective. We love you, Courtney. Thanks for the shout outs. Say hello to Danny and Logan. And I always forget your other child's name. Please forgive me. One of these days, I'm going to remember that name. Lisa writes, identity can be lost in religion. There is such a high expectation of living and you become lost. Great comments from all our listeners. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Natasha, for talking about identity. Identity is huge, and it's hard to think of a more interwoven, tight-knit identity than Mormonism, other than like Orthodox Judaism, Orthodox Islam, Scientology. We are up there in the top 5 to 10 most intense identities. So it's going to be a loss. Margi, why don't you speak to meaning and purpose really quick?
Okay. So with meaning and purpose, I think it's natural amidst transition to also feel like you really have to renegotiate your sense of meaning in life, and also your purpose in the world. And it's very common to have sort of things feel like they crumble. Your tower of sorts crumbles, and you're kind of looking around. And so and all I would say is, this is entirely normal, and it takes some time to rebuild this sense of how you feel meaning in your own life. And it can look really, really different from person to person. I would say one thing, just as like a little bit of a teaser, that can often be really helpful are values. Something initially that's very stabilizing, that allows people to kind of connect with themselves as they've lost sort of that listening to a prophet or getting, their meaning and purpose from an external source, is this idea of just coming back to values, things that they resonate with, things that bring them joy, so expect to have sort of a grappling or a reckoning with your purpose in life and how you find meaning, how you move through the world, and what feels good to you.
Love it. Back on the topic of identity, Judy writes, hey, Judy, I think Judy's in Louisiana. Shout out to Judy. She writes, one of my first crises was, who am I? Mm-hmm. That's a good one. Natasha, why don't you talk about morality and even sexuality in the terms of the difficult aspects of a faith crisis?
Well, I think you spoke to this well when you were talking about, even with the parenting, that we feel like morality comes from religion oftentimes. And although religion talks about morality, it's not the owner of morality. And so I think that, and oftentimes we think of morality as a checkbox list, like do this, don't do that. I've heard you talk about this, John, like when you think about family values, oftentimes, especially in our current cultural climate here in the United States, it's just, don't have an abortion, don't have premarital sex, do this, don't do that. It's like a do and don't list, instead of really looking at our morals and our ethics and when I talk about sexuality, I talk about the 6 principles of sexual health, which shouldn't matter what religion or non-religion you're in. They should kind of apply because they're principles that kind of, they go beyond any one religion. And when you look at the golden rule, for example, that's something that you can find in every religion and non-religion. People kind of just that they see that as a value. And so I think it's important. Well, we'll talk about what we can do about it, but I think it's important to recognize that if you're going through a faith transition, or if you're supporting someone in faith transition, morality comes up as a big, scary bucket. Because does this mean that I'm going to start acting in immoral ways? Does this mean that my partner or my child is going to start acting in immoral ways? How do we define morality? What is morality, right? And oftentimes too, if this is happening at a time when kind of midlife, the late 30s to, I would say, mid 50s, that's a developmental stage where we're kind of supposed to be reworking a lot of things in our life anyway. So if you have like what I call the double doozy of a life transition and a religious transition, then all of a sudden we can start kind of reworking our morality, and we might be doing things or exploring things that can be scary to either individuals or family members from that perspective. So I think it's one of those things that we'll address more in the future, but it's definitely something that comes up as scary and not sure how to negotiate when people first start this journey.
Love it. KJC writes, I love that. Religion is not the owner of morality. And then he writes, yes. And Jennifer, our friend Jennifer, Jennifer White, she writes, it can be scary to take responsibility over your life and own your decisions. It can be healthier, but for some people, it is less scary to do what the bishop said than to pay attention to yourself. And I think that's really true. I'll never forget an Elders Quorum lesson where I'm trying to teach this edgy lesson, and a dude raises his hand in the back and says, I just want someone to tell me what to do. Like, my life is so complex and so difficult. I don't need any of this liberal, progressive, intellectual mumbo jumbo. I literally just want someone to tell me what to do.
Yeah.
And that's real for some people. I'm not making fun of that guy. That was his reality.
Yeah.
And it can be scary.
And that's why this offers structure to so many people, and to have morality conceptualized within a religious framework for a lot of people, that is very helpful. But that doesn't mean that there isn't morality outside of that structure either.
Absolutely. Judy comments again, I referred my morality to what the church taught. Starting to make decisions was a challenge at first, but it got easier. Thank you, Judy. Yeah. And then Tim adds, the most difficult aspect for me is the feeling of overwhelming guilt when the rest of my family is, Orthodox or TBM, true believing Mormon, and we have a missionary out in the field. The guilt comes from others questioning my decision to not be a part of the church. Tim, that's a great point. Guilt, we talked a little bit earlier about feeling like a disappointment to family and friends. Thank you for sharing and being vulnerable, Tim. We really appreciate that. All right, I'll talk about death and afterlife. I'd say one of the core kernels of the existence of religion is the fact that it has evolved to help us deal with the fact that we all die. I imagine cavemen or, Cro-Magnon man or, whatever primitive ancestors 20,000 years ago, staring at their dead child, staring at their dead partner, staring at members of their dead tribe, wondering what happens when we die. I love these people, now they're gone. Is this the end? Will I ever see them again? Why are we all here if we just die anyway? What's the purpose? One of the main things religion offers is answers to those questions about death and mortality and dying and the afterlife. And not only is it about solving the problem of death, but it's about making death, taking away the sting of death by making death seem awesome, by, angels and rewards and even, becoming a god someday. Those are all, rewards that we're anticipating as Mormons if we believe in God and an afterlife. And going through a faith crisis just immediately strikes at the heart of that, which means that anyone you're talking to, and the older that they get, probably the more sensitive they're going to be to this issue, you're dealing with and you're attacking potentially their worldview as it relates to death and the afterlife. And it can cause panic and fear comparable to the panic you would feel if a lion's running after you in the savannah. You can feel that sort of panic and fear when somebody challenges your beliefs about the afterlife, because it can mean your hopes of seeing grandma or your child who passed away again are all interwoven there. And so when you lose your faith, or when you talk about your loss of faith with others, people can immediately go to that place, and it can be very dark and scary. Now, there's plenty of ways to reconcile that. We're going to show our little leg and give you a teaser and say we're not going to tell you what those are, but we will be doing an episode on death and the afterlife, if not multiple. So stay tuned, but that can be terrifying.
Yep.
Kim, do you want to read Kimberly's comment?
Oh, sure. Morality within the framework of punishment from God is a transactional morality. Morality without fear of punishment from God is untied to a transaction and is instead a gift.
Love it.
So beautifully said.
That's Kimberly weighing in on morality with and without God.
Yep.
Were you going to say something about death?
I was going to say something about death. I was going to say, I hope you don't mind if I add just a component to this that's difficult, is there's the death of, humans, our people we love. There's us kind of, I think, renegotiating or looking at our own mortality. And then there's also just loss and grief in this process. And that's not something we have mentioned yet, but there is like the death of, what you thought your life would look like, what your family would be, what your future was going to be. There can be kind of a death of a dream, if you will. And so this kind of grief and loss is something that is a key part of transition, and learning to grieve, learning how you grieve. People grieve, in very, very different ways. And it's a journey unto itself, learning what you need, learning, how you express sorrow, and what really piecing together, if you will, a framework that allows you to live in a way that is fully present and really loving those around you. Yeah, it's a key part of the transition process, don't you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a million cuts of grieving. A faith crisis is the death of 1,000 beliefs or perspectives or relationships or whatever. Natasha, I know we got to get you out of here. So is there something you want to add before we kind of wrap up?
No, I was just going to say that we're not implying, and I don't think you meant to imply this. I'm just wanting to be careful that we're not implying that everybody who goes through a faith crisis loses their belief in an afterlife or anything like that. So it's just, but that I think what you're saying is that it just challenges that belief, and it's something that people have to relook at and then decide how they're going to come out on the other end of their transitions. So
yeah, I like this. The data that we've researched show that about a little over half of, Mormons who go through a faith crisis end up atheist or agnostic. But what that means is about another half don't, and they still believe in God and Jesus or whatever. So that's or even Mormonism, So that's a really good point you make, Natasha. Really quick, Margi, you had a point on chaos and instability. Did you already make it, or did you want to talk about that last?
I can do it really quickly.
Okay.
It's just the idea that if you take everything that we've listed so far, they're the kind of journeys unto themselves, right? Where you begin in one place and you're going to journey through, and you're likely going to end up in the present moment in a very different place that's going to more fully reflect you. And so, but amidst this, the challenges is that there can be a loss of a structure of sorts where you are trying to recreate one or remake one or renovate one, or, different structures for each of these components. And so that can be a very challenging thing. It can feel chaotic. It can feel overwhelming. You can feel unprepared to do the work, especially because it can feel like you have to have it all sorted out and you're kind of doing it all at the same time. So you can kind of expect that that's a very normal thing to feel as part of your process. And that's why we have a whole kind of space for self-care and for connecting with yourself. And so just know that chaos and instability is part of the process as well.
All right.
Ambiguity is where we're going to be playing, but it's hard. Like we mentioned, change is hard. So
that's right.
Yeah, dwelling in the land of ambiguity. All right, Natasha, we want to give you the last word for today before we kind of sign off. We've had some great comments from our participants, from our listeners. But Natasha, we know you got to run. So
yeah, I've got to run, but I thought I would offer my homework assignment that I came up with.
So let's jump to the homework section, which is
and then you can continue after that if you want to read some more comments or whatever you want to do. Feel free to continue without me. But I got a kiddo and his sister already at the doctor's appointment. So
all right,
we'll see. Okay, so we've talked about trying to come up with homework assignments that address 4 different areas in your life. And not that we always come up with one that will address all 4, but this idea that you're going to try to address your physical body, you're going to try to address your emotional kind of life, your spirituality, and socially. So I thought, as I thought through this process, what I could come up with, and this is what I came up with. So take it or leave it. So I thought that you could start off by journaling, just kind of, as you've listened to us, what were the things that resonated with you? What are the things that you feel have been difficult for you as you've gone through a Mormon faith crisis or supported someone in a faith crisis? And then, so just kind of come up with your list of kind of your wounds and your areas of sadness. And then I would say, I would like for you to, this is where you invoke your body. So that was kind of an emotional thing. This is where you invoke your body. And I would like for you to figure out a way to verbalize this. So you're using your mouth. So whether you say a prayer or whether you state a self-reflection or whether you talk to the universe or whatever, but you're verbally sharing what you came up with to either yourself or to God or to whoever you want to share it to. And then I would like for you to have some type of ritual so before you've done that, I guess, light a candle or something. So then at the end of that prayer or meditation or self-reflection, you blow out the candles. It's kind of like a beginning and an end to that ritual. And then, so that's physical, emotional, spiritual. Physical, emotional, sorry. The spiritual part of this was to come up with or find a mantra that speaks to journeys or new territories or kind of something along those lines so that you can see this as kind of a difficult aspect as the starting of a new journey. So that can speak to your spirituality. And the social part was to maybe, if you have somebody that you feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable with, and remember, vulnerability, back to Brené's Brown point, means safety on the other end at some level. There has to be some level of safety, that you could potentially share that list with somebody you care about, with the disclaimer that they're just to listen. They're not to fix anything about what you're presenting, that you're just offering a gift of some of the things that you're currently struggling with without any expectation or even desire for them to say, oh, well, let me help you with that. Or here's an idea that could help with that. It's just, this is what I'm dealing with. And the person who's receiving can go, thank you for sharing that list with me. That's it. So those were my thoughts. Take it or leave them. Some of these are helpful. Some of these maybe aren't. And I'll leave you to kind of close up. Does that sound good?
We love you, Natasha. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us.
I love you guys too. And I love all the commenters and all the people who show up. So some of you I know personally, and it's so nice to see you on there. And those of you who I don't, I would hope our paths can cross sometime, or our paths are crossing in this way. So that's beautiful. Check
out Natasha at natashaparker.org if you need any of her wisdom on a one-on-one basis.
Thank you. All right. We'll see you all next time. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Natasha. All right. Well, we've got a few comments that I want to read because the listeners are giving us great comments today.
Great.
As usual. Lisa writes, I think of it as this is my chance to learn and grow and build myself into a kind, nice, loving individual and to do the best I can. So if there is an afterlife, at least I know I gave my best self on this journey I've been on. That's Lisa addressing shifting perspectives on death and the afterlife.
Yeah, I love that, Lisa.
Victoria writes, "This is so true, Margi Dehlin. Thank you." So she just thinks you're wise.
Oh, that's lovely.
I agree. JC writes, "Mormons even take control of our life before." Oh yeah, we didn't mention the pre-existence, right? JC writes, "I had to tell my stepmom, stop telling me we chose this life together after my parents divorced, that we must have been okay to say yes. She was horribly offended, but stop including me in this afterlife, but pre-life so much too." Yeah, JC, you're making a good point that Mormonism that's part of the meaning and purpose that Mormonism can give us. It not only tells us who we are and where we're going, it tries to tell us where we came from. And for some, that's beautiful, but for others, that can shift and become not so kind and useful. And JC's reminding us of that.
Yeah.
Kathy writes, "I am so surprised at how many levels there are to process while going through a faith crisis."
Yes. Yes. And I think, as we've kind of sectioned these out into different points, but they also blend, like they affect each other. So as you're going, so true.
And then Casey gives a shout out to all of us, says he loves the podcast and says Natasha's amazing. Casey, you missed it. We actually gave a shout out to you for becoming a monthly donor subscriber at the beginning of this podcast. So go back and listen. You'll hear the shout out. But that's a shout out. If any of you have already chosen to sort of go to MormonFaithCrisis.com and donate, we just want to thank you for that. We really do. And if you have already, chances are we gave you a shout out at the beginning of the episode. You need to go back and listen to it. Kimberly, we'll always read Kimberly's comments. She writes, "Yes, Lisa's comment is beautiful. I think it can be helpful to think about not replacing morality, but instead to discover and pursue our own personal noble purpose. And we will find that we often arrive at something higher than our previous state of morality." Sounds like what you're saying, Kimberly, is don't worry about the do's and don'ts and shoulds and shouldn'ts. Go out and lead this fulfilling, meaningful, purposeful life, and your behavior will orient towards helping you achieve those objectives. And maybe you'll find yourself to be healthier and happier without even thinking about the term morality.
Yeah. And I love that because it points to the gift, which is what we always like coming back to. There are these hard things, these losses, these renegotiations that we have in process, but there are potential gifts that come from those times. And then you oftentimes arrive at something that feels like you. It actually reflects you, and you have this sense of who you are at the end that you may not have had at the beginning.
Kimberly writes, "Yes, yes, 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 yes."
Oh.
I think she approves of my interpretation of her wise comment.
Yeah.
All right, listeners, we are concluding another episode or two of The Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. Thank you for joining us. It's been amazing. And there are some things you can do to help us if you want, no pressure. We'd love it if you would like our Facebook page that you're on right now. We would love you to share this with anyone who you think might be able to benefit from it. We love your comments. We love you to email us. And if you need any individual support, you can reach Margi at
beautyinthenow.org.
Beautyinthenow.org is Margi's coaching practice. I'm at johndehlin.com, JOHNDEHLIN.com. Natasha's at natashaparker.org. And of course, if you want to attend one of our upcoming events, and I should stress this, in the next week or two, we'll be announcing our initial calendar for workshops and retreats in 2019. Look for that. And at mormonfaithcrisis.org/events, along with the intensive couples retreat we're planning with Natasha in early next year in Salt Lake, and Natasha's mixed faith couples workshop she's doing just in a week or two. So check all that out at mormonfaithcrisis.com/events. And Casey says, check your email. I sent you both an email with a journal entry after episode 1. Thank you, Casey. We will check that out, and we may even share a little bit of that next time.
With your
permission.
Of course.
All right, everyone. We sure love you. Go make
Thanks for joining us.
A great, beautiful life. Turn this lemon of a faith crisis into lemonade, in or out of Mormonism. We love you. Thanks for your support. Tune in again next week or on iTunes or on YouTube for another episode of The Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
We'll see you guys again very soon.